Well, if you don't know by now, our theme for today has to do with house and family. Our text for today and a whole plethora of other texts in the scriptures allude to and connect concepts of house and home and family. In fact, the word house is used nearly 2,000 times in the Bible, sometimes interchangeably with family, as in the house of, meaning the family of. Therefore, in these concepts, relationship is implied. And the scope of those relationships is expanded when we consider the notion of household, which in early Jewish cultures included all those who shared the common space of the family, including slaves and concubines and children of slaves and many others who worked together in a household and lived together. House, home, and family are also often used as metaphors in the scriptures. Metaphors for the realm of God, both here and in the time to come. A metaphor for the people of God, for the way of Christ. We hear stories about the stones on which Jacob slept, which he declared the house of God. We hear about that house of Mary and Martha and Lazarus that Jesus considered something of a home for himself. And of course we hear of the familial house of David and the temple as the house of God. The temple stood as the dwelling place of Yahweh. Solomon's temple is said to be filled with the glory of God, where the very stones of the house, so literal stones, being seen as anointed with the breath of God. And we still, of course, use the language of house and family in speaking of faith communities today. We heard it this morning as the microphone was being passed, and people talked about this family or this house. This morning we began our worship by singing, "Welcome to this house," setting a tone of openness, of open house and invitation, emphasizing that in this community we're included. This is a place where we can find nurture, where we can be free to be ourselves with our struggles as well as our successes and delights. Really like an ideal family home. We're saying that this house offers shelter and safety, a place of belonging, a place of comfort and nurture. I love the poetic text from the epistle of 1 Peter. It offers us beautiful images of home in the community of Christ and says this: "Come to Jesus, a living stone rejected by mortals, yet chosen and precious in God's sight. And like living stones, let yourselves be built into a spiritual house." Members of this household of Christ then are to function like Christ. That is, in the words of 1 Peter, to be living stones. That is, like the stones of the temple, the ones of Solomon's temple that were animated with the breath of God. If we are living stones, animated with the breath of God, we are built then into a spiritual dwelling, into a holy house. The people to whom Peter's letter was written were without home, without a spiritual house. You see, the writer addresses Christian converts of a variety of nationalities who have been persecuted and displaced, perhaps because of their faith. Some were called transient strangers or resident aliens, travelers and refugees. They spoke various languages, wore different clothing, practiced this odd religion, and therefore were treated with resentment and suspicion, were persecuted. The writer offers then the richness of appropriating the word house as both household, that is a place of acceptance and belonging, and as temple, the dwelling place of God. The writer then invites the readers to allow themselves to be built into something they didn't have, a spiritual temple. Allow yourselves to be a spiritual temple, to be both family and the actual location of God's indwelling. The readers of 1 Peter, then, don't need to depend on structures or even on formulations for a spiritual house. They can actually be it. They can be a place of God's indwelling. And then they can offer that sense of home and extravagant welcome to others who are homeless. Early in my ministry, I had the privilege of working with people who were experiencing homelessness. Part of that work, of course, was to help people find affordable housing, find a place that they could actually get a shelter over their heads. Through an organization for whom I was working, through Atlanta Urban Ministries, I got to know a man named Charlie. In our work with Charlie, he'd come a really long way. He got a job. He got clean and mostly sober. But it was the oddest thing. Charlie refused to take an apartment. We found a nice apartment for him that he could actually afford on his salary, and he refused. It seemed to us that housing would be the most important factor in helping Charlie establish a more stable life. So I went to visit Charlie. I went to visit him at his plywood home under a bridge and tried to reason with him, to cajole him into safer accommodation. But instead, during this visit, I discovered the reason for Charlie's reluctance to move. You see, Charlie and about 15 others lived there, sharing food that they'd been able to buy or that they'd been given from food banks, building a fire and telling stories around the fire, generally looking out for each other's safety and well-being. In other words, they shared home. It was indeed a spiritual house of sorts, where all were welcomed and cared for. And Charlie saw that he had too much to lose by leaving that house, and he wouldn't hear of it. He had no building, no walls to contain anything that he might own, no family that claimed him exactly. But love was there, and mercy and compassion and kindness, and a degree of hope, I found. Come to Christ, a living stone rejected by mortals, yet chosen and precious in God's sight. And like living stones, let yourselves be built into a spiritual house. Charlie, it seems, had this kind of house. And by his own definition, Charlie had a family as well. We know that both Judaism and Christianity have a lot to say about families. Primarily, I think, if we can kind of boil it down to its essence, that we humans are like God, that we're created for relationship with God and with each other. And the Old Testament includes all those begats, indicating who's who in which family or which house, what they pass on by virtue of being in the house of some patriarch or another. And in our gospel story today, Jesus talks about family. You heard that he had a disappointing moment, to say the least, with his family. He'd been going from town to town caring for people and who had returned to his family, to his house, and the crowd followed. The verses immediately preceding this gospel lesson tell us that the crowd was so persistent that he couldn't even sit down and eat in peace. Some were saying he was out of his mind. And when his family heard the ruckus, did they come to his defense? No. They actually went to restrain him. And I must point out that some translations of Mark's gospel say that his family were actually the ones who said he was out of his mind. But at any rate, their restraint of him shows that they kind of must have agreed, even if they didn't say it. Not exactly a model of supportive, loving family. In fact, their behavior was pretty close to betrayal. And it was certainly devoid of any understanding of Jesus' message or recognition of his gifts or his way of life. It shines a spotlight on the things that separate them, on their differences. In response, Jesus makes a bold statement. He does what those who have some odd, made-up idea of what the scriptures actually say about families tell us we must never do. Jesus redefines family, and he does it in a big way. Faced with a biological family who not only misunderstood him, but were willing to kind of throw him under the bus, Jesus turns to those who really see him, who connect with him and with his passion. And he declared right then and there that these were his mother and brothers, his closest kin. This is a radical message that stands in stark contrast with ongoing pronouncements in our day about what constitutes biblical or Christian or proper families, by which some, of course, mean a model of family that's caricatured by 1950s and 60s sentimental television families. But that has never been a true story about families. We've just heard Jesus' own testimony to that fact. Those who still attempt to perpetuate polished and sanitized versions of historic American families ignore the facts. The fact, for example, that in the early 1900s, alcohol consumption, mostly by fathers in families, was triple what it is today. And that a century ago, 20% of all American children lived in orphanages. While Father Knows Best was at the top of the television charts in 1957, so were teenage pregnancies at an all-time high. Families indeed have a troubled past. And you know that biblical families were like even worse. Take Abraham, for example. The patriarch of 3 of the world's great religions, whose wife Sarah persuaded him to sleep with her maid so that he could father a son. And Jacob's family, whose father-in-law tricked him into marrying the sister of the woman he loved instead of his true love. So then he marries both of them. Subsequently, 11 of their children sold their brother into slavery, but that was instead of murdering him, which was the original plan. This is the real story, part of the real story, of biblical families. In a church history class, I heard the story once of a professor who read a letter from a parent to a government official. The parent complains that their son, who had just received the best education and was headed for a great job as a lawyer, was involved in a weird religious sect. Members of this sect controlled his every move, had taken his money and given it to a common purse. The parent then pleads with the government to do something about this weird religious group that was tearing their family apart. Then the professor looks back, smugly, I'm sure, and says, "Who do you think this letter was describing?" He then shocks his students when he explains that the letter was written by a 3rd century Roman father concerning a group called the Church. A major criticism of the Romans against the Christians is that they destroyed and redefined the family. Like Jesus, early Christians claimed kinship with those who shared their love of God, their commitment to living lives of peace and compassion and justice and service. They were known by their familial love for each other. Almost daily in our day, we're witnessing cultural shifts in the definition of families. For the most part, I believe, and I'm happy to say, that the circle of love seems to be widening and the definitions expanding. We now consider definitions of family to include those who would have been excluded from the church only a few decades ago. Heterosexual families with 2 working adults outside the home. Many blended families, single-parent families headed by either men or women, some who have never been married. Single people who have rich webs of friendships. Gay families, some with children, some without, some children who are biological, some who are adopted, some adopted from this culture, some from other cultures, some with more than two parents raising children. Jesus said that those who do the will of God are his family. In other words, those who share his way of life, those who understand him and believe him, not in the believe in Jesus sense, but those who actually listen to him and follow him, who don't betray, who seek his company, those who are connected to him spiritually. They know him, and he knows them, and together they build a spiritual house where members are joined by love and covenant. Those who follow Jesus in our day as well are to become a house for aliens and strangers. Those first church members, we know, were not of the same house at all. They were women of means, women with nothing, slaves, those who were dabbling in foreign religions, soldiers gone AWOL, persecuted Jews. They shared nothing in common, except they had ended up walking together along this way of Jesus, and that they were known by the love for the ones they considered family. We're invited to build that sort of house together in this place. Living stones joined to the corner, to be family to one another, and then to expand that family, that sisterhood and brotherhood and parenthood to all who would be a part. Who are our brothers and sisters and mothers who don't yet know that they have a place in this family? When we build ourselves and invite the Spirit to build us into a spiritual house, when we dare to redefine families as Jesus did, we become a holy house, the dwelling place of God. It's the most socially and politically and spiritually powerful thing we can do. Let us build a house where love is known, a house with open doors, with many points of access, of joining, of becoming part of the family. Let us build a house where we're clear and specific about who is welcome because we say their names, rather than putting out a sign that say all are welcome. May we say with our lives and with our words, come, come, you who don't know what to believe, or even don't know if you can believe at all, come. Come those with lots of education or little. Come queer and trans folk. Come those of you without documents to say you have a right to be here. You have a right to be here, and so come. Let us build a house and be a family together. May it be so. Amen.